Welcome to the podcast, Amazing Tales from Off the Beaten Path, and I'm your host, Mike Allen. John Hancock had a bounty on his head. The British wanted the Sons of Liberty agitator arrested and executed. So why did he show up in plain sight for a public wedding in Connecticut that everyone, even the British, knew about? Well, joining us today to take a look at this fascinating chapter is Nina Sankovich. Nina's bringing a lot more to the table than just this incredible story of the Hancock wedding. In fact, you're going to hear how just three families from one town basically started the American Revolution. Nina's author of several nonfiction books, including the one we're going to be referencing today, American Rebels, How the Hancock, Adams, and Quincy Families Fanned the Flames of Revolution. Nina's going to be along in just a moment with her spellbinding story. This week's trivia question: how did a worm launch one of the industrial era's biggest and most profitable enterprises in the world? We'll stick around after the main program for the answer, because then you're going to know what we're talking about next week. Why did the American Revolution really begin, and who started the Patriot opposition? Well, today we've got a wonderful guest who studied this question in depth, mainly because she did a very deep dive on three famous families from the colonial era who were centrally involved in different but overlapping ways. The Hancocks, the Adams, and the Quincy's all shared one very important thing in common. They grew up together in the same town outside Boston, the town of Braintree, and they were impacted by the same events and became close friends, and in one case, lovers. Well, Nina Sankovich was handed the impossible request of trying to boil down the incredible research she did, which is captured in her 350-page award-winning nonfiction book, American Rebels, How the Hancock, Adams, and Quincy Families Fanned the Flames of Revolution. Now, the book follows the intertwined lives of several colonial-era figures: John Hancock, John Adams, Josiah Quincy Jr., Abigail Smith Adams, and Dorothy, or Dolly, Quincy Hancock. Now, Nina argues that their shared childhood experiences and beliefs, which she has tracked down, led them to eventually play distinct but interspersed roles in fanning those flames of revolution. One very intriguing part of the story involves the wedding of two of those people, John Hancock and Dolly Quincy, at a house in Fairfield, Connecticut, but not before a bit of a triangular love affair took place involving none other than Aaron Burr. Without further ado, Nina Sankovich. So Nina, let's try and condense this 350 pages of your American Rebels book into 20 minutes, a completely unfair task ahead of us. But I want to do, a little bit of Braintree. So for people who aren't familiar, Braintree's about 10 miles south of Boston, but back then it's where three of our most important families came together: the Hancocks, the Adams, and the Quincy's. And I find it remarkable, and you do a great job of explaining, even though they came from decidedly different economic stations in life, they had similar values. Could you explain what brought them together?
Sure. First, I want to also point out that present-day Braintree is not where the Quincy's and Adams and Hancocks all grew up. It's actually the town of Quincy. What's now called Quincy then was Braintree. So a little bit confusing, but for people who want to go see the house that John Adams grew up in, they would go to Quincy, Mass, where there's the amazing John Adams National Park. And they can also visit one of the Quincy houses there. So they all grew up in this small town. John Hancock's father was a reverend. He'd gone to Harvard. His father had gone to Harvard, so in a long line of educated men. John Adams was the son of a yeoman farmer who worked hard, but just was not of the same social class as the Quincy's or the Hancocks. The Quincy's were the gentry of the town, had a lot of money, enjoyed fine wines, traveled, educated their daughters. But in this small town of Braintree, these people all spent time together, went to school together. The Quincy's and John Hancock would eventually send their sons to Latin school in Boston, but the early years of education were in the town. They all went to the same church, the same stores, shared the same green. And as kids, they played together, they hung out together. And as they grew into young men and young women, they socialized together. And in ways that we would recognize, they played cards, they played games, they went for moonlight walks and flirted with each other. So getting to know the figures from history in a way that really shows them as sort of people that we can recognize really makes what they did as sort of leading the revolution in some ways that much more remarkable.
It is fascinating when you stop and think that we all grow up with people who we call friends during life, and if some of them go on to fame and fortune or something like this is exactly what you're talking about, except that these were phenomenal families in terms of the early colonial period of America. Let's just do a very, and I'm not going to do this justice, but just a quick recite of what happened in terms of the 1760s and 1770s that led up to problems in the relationship between Americans and the Brits. Obviously, there was the taxation without representation, and in 1765, the Sons of Liberty was formed by Sam Adams, and then, of course, John Hancock got involved with that. Then you had the Boston Massacre in 1770, which was so interesting because you had John Adams defending the British soldiers who killed 5 colonialists at that site. 1773, the Boston Tea Party, which we all know about. And then in April 1775, the top blows off everything in Lexington and Concord with the shot heard around the world. Now, I just gave a quick summary. Would you kindly hit on what you think were the key parts of all that in terms of fomenting the revolution?
Well, your summary is good. And I think what we have to just look back at is why all of a sudden did Britain start paying so much attention to what was going on in the colonies and start taxing the colonies? Because really, since the sort of migration from England to America first began, in the 1630s and on, England, by and large, left the colonies, granted the different charters, but then left the colonies to kind of figure out their economies themselves and take care of things themselves. And there were obviously royal officials and there were duties and things that had to be paid. But then Britain got involved in what was a world war, which was the 7 Years' War. And Britain came out of it victorious and had a lot more property, but also basically coffers empty, no more money to run this enlarged empire that they had built. The regular citizens in England couldn't be taxed anymore because they'd been taxed to the limit. So, okay, who are we going to tax? Let's start focusing on the colonies and getting more money from them. So it was kind of this abrupt change in British policy that really surprised the Americans. Why are we now being asked to pay for all this? We sent our men to fight. American colonists died in the fight for Britain in the 7 Years' War, what we call the French and Indian War here. That was sort of the first stirrings of why are they doing this to us? We've never been interfered with like this before. And then when Britain sent troops to enforce these new taxes and new duties, all of a sudden there were British soldiers living in the American towns and villages, and the American colonists really didn't like that. And that's really what led to the Boston Massacre. It was this tension between these British soldiers living in American villages and towns like Boston and not mixing with the colonists in any kind of good way. So you have all of these factors that really led Americans to start thinking, well, what does it mean actually, to be a colony, and what would it mean to be something different? Now, what's also really important for our discussion, especially if we want to kind of focus on Connecticut and Massachusetts, New England area, is that in these years, it was really the New England colonies that were bearing the brunt of sort of British interference and then later British oppression. Other colonies were fearful it was going to happen to them, but they were really watching from afar as people in Boston suffered. During like the battles of Lexington and Concord, well, those were New Englanders who fought and who died, whose towns were ransacked. It's interesting to see how the other colonies I think they were more willing to negotiate with Britain over what was happening, whereas New Englanders were like, we are getting threatened in our homes, and we don't want to be part of England anymore. And you see in the writings of John Adams and Josiah Quincy and John Hancock, not only in their public writings, but the letters they wrote, among friends, private letters, they were really outraged by what England was doing to their own citizens. These American colonists said, we are British citizens. We are not being protected by the British Constitution. We have to protect ourselves. We have to fight for ourselves. So they really did have to get the rest of the colonies on board, because the rest of the colonies were like, oh, this might happen to us, but maybe it's only going to happen to you guys because you're troublemakers. So that kind of dynamic was interesting to see that play out in terms of what it meant for the families that I looked at, that, John Hancock and John Adams and the Quincy family. And what they really realized is we have to show that we're reasonable. We're not these crazy rebels. We're reasonable. Josiah Quincy went on this trip to the southern colonies to make the argument, look, we're reasonable, honorable men and women, and we're being treated terribly by England, and we need you on our side. To see how that was really led by New England, this fight for liberty. And then eventually the other colonies got on board. And then if you look closely and say, well, wow, it really comes down to these families from this one village. It's just kind of incredible.
It's absolutely amazing. And now what we find out is the Battle of Lexington and Concord is in April of 1775. And 4 months later, we would find this wedding that you and I are going to talk about here coming up. But what happens now in April is just around the actual day of that battle, John Hancock, who has a bounty on his head, I'd love you to describe that as well, he flees and he goes down to Philly, where he is actually elected president of the Second Continental Congress. And Dorothy, she flees down to the Burr house in Fairfield. And so this brings in yet another family, the Burr family. And for 4 months, they would have this correspondence. Would you explain how all that happened and transpired?
Before the Battle of Lexington and Concord, John Hancock was in Boston living in his mansion. Dolly Quincy was in Boston living with her father. And John Hancock's aunt, Lydia, also lived with John Hancock in his mansion. And things were getting hot and dangerous, and there were British troops arising. There was a bounty on Hancock's head. The Massachusetts Assembly, the group that was working to fight the oppressions, they had been meeting in Cambridge, but things were getting a little too intense with British troops in Boston. So they said, let's move out to Concord and start meeting in Concord. And so John Hancock said, okay, we can all stay at what used to be my uncle's house, but now is the parsonage of another reverend, but we could all go stay there. So he sent Dolly and Lydia first, and then he followed, and they were staying there because they were attending the meetings in Concord. And then the British realized, well, look, John Hancock's in Lexington. The Assembly's meeting in Concord. We know they have ammunition stored. Let's go there. Let's arrest Sam Adams. Let's arrest John Hancock. Let's get the ammunition. We can do this quickly. We can do this easily. It's not going to be a good deal. These colonials are not organized. But we all know that they were organized, and that Paul Revere was able to alert John Hancock and everyone else staying at the parsonage in Lexington. The British are coming. The British are coming. Dolly Quincy literally witnessed, the battle on the green in Lexington, while John Hancock and Sam Adams fled Lexington because they didn't want to get, arrested and then executed. Dolly and Lydia actually stayed in Lexington, stayed in the parsonage, figuring here, we're safer here with this minister than we would be running off with these, refugees from the British army. So after the battle, they all get reunited again, and John Hancock says, I have to go down to Philadelphia, but I want you to be safe, so I want you out of Massachusetts. You go to the Burr family in Fairfield. Lydia and Dolly went to go stay at the homestead. John Hancock goes down and is welcomed as a hero in Philadelphia, elected president. Basically, he's president of the colonies. He's been elected president of Continental Congress, but basically, let's just call him the president of the, pre-United States. And he's in charge of a million things and has to sign a million documents. And he's charged with, raising money and getting more ammunition and just organizing things. And meanwhile, Dolly is up there in Connecticut. And further north, we have the Battle of Bunker Hill. where it's just a bloody, bloody battle. And lots of people on both sides die, even though it is a British victory. It's not really, because so many British soldiers die. But a very good friend of John Hancock is killed, Dr. Joseph Warren. He's one of the last to retreat off the hill, and he's, killed by a bayonet and just left to molder in a mass grave. Just a sidebar, what is interesting is a year later, when the Americans again have control of Bunker Hill in that area, they go to retrieve the bodies, and the way they identify the body of Dr. Joseph Warren is one of the first uses in history of looking at his teeth, because Paul Revere had made dentures for Joseph Warren, and he looked at this skull and said, "Oh, I know these dentures. This is my friend Joseph Warren." So it's one of the first times ever that, teeth of somebody were used to identify the remains. So that's just kind of an interesting aside there. John Hancock is a wanted man by the British. Like, he's okay while he's in Philadelphia, but when the Continental Congress shuts down for the summer, he's got to go back north because he's got to raise money and he's got to raise support. And he does it. He goes back and he says to Dolly, "And I'm going to come see you in Connecticut as soon as I can." He's writing her all the time. He writes long, really beautiful letters, and always with his gorgeous signature at the bottom. She's not really writing back. And we know that not just because there aren't letters, because it would be easy to say, well, letters disappear. But in his letters to her, he's saying, "My dearest, darlingest, beloved Dolly, why are you not writing to me? I want to hear from you. Please just send me a line." Well, it might be because Aaron Burr has come to stay at the house of his cousin, Thaddeus Burr, in Fairfield. He's been studying law in Litchfield at Tapping Reeve. That's the name of an actual person. Tapping Reeve has started a law school, and it's the first law school in the United States. But he's out for the summer, and he goes to his cousin's house there in Fairfield. And even though, what is he, like at least 10 years younger than Dolly Quincy, they hit it off. And at first, Aunt Lydia, John Hancock's Aunt Lydia, who's also staying there, is like, "Oh, he's a charming young man." But then everyone starts to get a little nervous. Is something happening between Dolly Quincy and Aaron Burr? They're just spending a lot of time together. Aunt Lydia may have said something to Thaddeus Burr. But all we do know is that in a few days after these sort of worries start surfacing, Aaron Burr is sent away. He's gone. And Aunt Lydia is writing to John Hancock saying, "Get yourself to Fairfield and get married already." So finally in August, John Hancock shows up. And again, there is a bounty, as I just keep saying, there's a bounty on his head, but it's true. I mean, someone could make a lot of money by capturing him and delivering him to the British, who would immediately execute him, John Hancock, that is. And yet John Hancock goes to Fairfield. People know he's in Fairfield. It's a public wedding. It's reported on in all the newspapers. And part of the reason for this is because among the American colonists, and I'm sure it was the same with actually the British, they're fascinated by this couple. They're like a celebrity couple. It's Dolly and John. I mean, people talk about them. They're two beautiful people. American colonists are actually naming their babies John Hancock and Dolly Quincy, and then adding whatever last name they happen to have. I mean, they are a celebrity couple. Everyone wants to know when they're finally going to get married. They do finally get married, August 28th, 1775. They get married. As I say, it's public. And somehow no one shows up to arrest Hancock. He has this public wedding. He and Dolly together return to Philadelphia for, again, the meetings of the American Continental Congress. And it is interesting to me, both that John Hancock dared to have this public wedding, but also that no one showed up to trouble him. I mean, there were loyalists in Connecticut. There were people who were on the British side, but everyone seemed to want this wedding to go forward and celebrated it.
So the house that stands there today is not actually the house that they got married in, is it? It burned down when the British came in and raided Fairfield and they had to rebuild it. But what did they rebuild it to resemble?
Well, they built it to resemble the house that John Hancock's uncle had built for himself on Beacon Hill. What's nice about having the Burr mansion resemble the mansion of John Hancock's family on Beacon Hill is that the house on Beacon Hill was demolished and is no longer there. But we know what it looks like because of the Burr Mansion. They also actually have rebuilt the Hancock Mansion in Ticonderoga, New York. So not really sure why it's there, but you can see it there.
I understand that the Beacon Hill site is now a Boston steakhouse.
Oh, is that true? Yeah, that's very possible. Or maybe it's where Cheers Bar is. No, it's not.
I love it. One last question. Why is John Hancock's signature so prominent?
Yeah, he had a beautiful signature. Now, of course, when he signed the Declaration of Independence, he was the first signer, but also he signed it on a day when not everyone was there. Maybe he just felt like, I have room, I can do this. And him having such a prominent signature also may have taken off the heat of the others who signed, because basically, once you sign that thing, you were saying, I am a traitor to Britain. I can be hanged for treason. You were basically admitting that you are willing to rise up against the mother country, putting a bounty on your head. Well, Hancock already had a bounty on his head, so big signature really didn't matter.
Well, that wraps up this episode of Amazing Tales from Off the Beaten Path. You know, the reconstructed house where John Hancock married Dolly Quincy is available to this day for rental for weddings and receptions. I want to thank our guest for today's program, award-winning author and historian Nina Sankovich, whose book American Rebels, How the Hancock, Adams, and Quincy Families Fanned the Flames of Revolution is a very worthwhile read. The answer to this week's trivia question. The question was, how did a worm launch one of the industrial era's biggest and most profitable enterprises in the world? Well, the answer is, if the worm was a silkworm, you would have the answer, because the top silk manufacturing facility anywhere in the world was in Connecticut, one of the largest operations of any kind in manufacturing at the time. And next week on Amazing Tales, we're going to see how the entrepreneurial Cheney brothers developed and grew a business in the 1800s on the backs of tiny silkworms, and in so doing helped launch the concept of corporate welfare. Wait until you hear about that. Amazing Tales from Off the Beaten Path is a production of True North Associates, LLC. This is Mike Allen. Be safe, and please stay healthy.